May 21, 1796. In a rented house on Market Street in Philadelphia, George Washington and his family sat down to dinner. In another room, a young woman quietly finished packing. Her name was Ona Judge. For 12 years, she had served as Martha Washington's personal maid, dressing the First Lady, repairing her clothes, and keeping her belongings in order. That evening, however, Ona was not preparing to serve the Washingtons. She was preparing to leave them forever. She was not escaping a beating that night. She was escaping something the household considered perfectly respectable, a wedding present. And what happened next would force the President of the United States to spend years trying to bring one young woman back. He never succeeded, but someone else would pay a terrible price. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Behind the Throne, where we tell the stories of the people who stood beside power, the wives, the children, the servants, and the people who saw what happened behind closed doors. History remembers the men whose faces appear on coins and monuments. It remembers presidents, generals, and kings, but it rarely remembers the people who stood quietly behind them. Tonight, we go back to an America most people barely recognize. The year is 1796. The Republic is only 7 years old. There is no White House, and Washington, D.C. does not yet exist. The nation's capital is Philadelphia, a crowded city filled with printers, merchants, sailors, politicians, churches, and a growing free black community. And inside a rented house on Market Street lived George Washington, the first president of the United States, now approaching the end of his second term. 8 enslaved people lived inside that presidential household. One of them was Ona Judge. On May 24th, a notice appeared in the Philadelphia Gazette offering $10 for her capture. The advertisement described her carefully: her eyes, her hair, her height, her appearance, and the good clothes she had taken with her. It said she had absconded. It said there had been no provocation. But that was the Washington household's version of the story, not Ona's. She was about 22 years old. For 12 years, she had served Martha Washington as a personal maid. She had laid out the First Lady's clothes, repaired them, carried her belongings, and remained constantly within reach. She had been born at Mount Vernon, the plantation of the man who would become America's first president. She had never earned a wage. She had never been taught to read. And now, while the most famous family in America sat down to dinner, Ona Judge simply walked out the door. What followed was no minor footnote. Over the next 3 years, George Washington would involve government officials, his Treasury Secretary, a federal customs collector, and his own family in an effort to bring her back. He would use the legal machinery of a government he helped create. But he would never get her back. Ona would live another 52 years, marry a sailor, lose her husband, bury her children, learn to read as an adult, and eventually live in poverty on the New Hampshire coast. Near the end of her life, someone would ask her the question that seems almost impossible to answer. After everything freedom had cost her, did she ever regret running away? Her answer would become the final and most powerful line of her story. But Ona Judge's story did not begin in Philadelphia. It began years earlier at Mount Vernon, with her mother, Betty, a skilled seamstress who worked at Mansion House Farm. Betty's hands were constantly busy with fabric, clothing, repairs, and the endless work required to keep a great plantation household running. Around 1773, she had a daughter named Ona. Her father was almost certainly Andrew Judge, a white English tailor hired by George Washington. But under Virginia law, a child followed the condition of the mother. Andrew was free. Betty was enslaved. So Ona was born enslaved. She grew up on the estate of a man who would later become the symbol of American independence, even though she herself had been denied the freedom that independence was supposed to represent. Ona never knew her exact age. Decades later, when asked how old she was, she could only estimate. There was another detail that would shape the rest of her life. Ona did not legally belong to George Washington. Martha Washington's first husband, Daniel Parke Custis, had died leaving behind a large estate that included more than 100 enslaved people. Martha held those people during her lifetime, but they were tied to the Custis inheritance. When she died, they would pass to her descendants. Ona, her mother Betty, and her younger sister Delphi were among them. They were known as dower slaves, a cold legal term for human beings whose futures had already been assigned to heirs who had not even grown up. Washington could not simply sell them, and he could not legally free them. Ona's future had been decided before she was old enough to understand what ownership meant. When Ona was about 10 years old, she was brought into the mansion house to serve Martha Washington personally. She was skilled with a needle, and that skill became part of her identity. She helped Martha dress and bathe, cleaned and repaired her clothes, arranged her belongings, and remained close to her almost constantly. George Washington later described her as a perfect mistress of her needle. It sounds like praise, but it also reveals how he saw her through her usefulness. For 12 years, Ona was one of the first people Martha Washington saw each morning. She was close enough to observe the private world of one of America's most powerful families, yet no one gave her the basic freedom of education. Decades later, visitors recorded that she had received no mental or moral instruction while living with the Washingtons. No reading, no writing, nothing. She lived inside a celebrated household filled with generals, politicians, ministers, and foreign visitors, but no one taught her to read a single word. And Ona was watching. She noticed things her employers never imagined she noticed. In old age, when asked about the Washington family's religious practices, she remembered that she had never heard George Washington pray. She said Martha Washington read prayers, but added that she did not consider that praying. It was a remarkably direct answer from a woman who had spent 12 years watching a family that never imagined she was watching them back. Then came 1789. America elected its first president, and the man chosen was George Washington. The household moved north, first to New York and then to Philadelphia. Ona was 15 when she was taken along. She left her mother behind at Mount Vernon. Her younger sister Delphi remained there too. For Ona, Philadelphia was unlike anything she had ever known. At Mount Vernon, the plantation had been an entire world. In Philadelphia, the world came toward her. Printers, sailors, merchants, dockworkers, Quakers, tradesmen, and thousands of black residents filled the streets. Most importantly, Ona saw black men and women who were free. They worked where they chose. They walked where they wanted. They made their own decisions. She was 15 years old, and for the first time, freedom was not an idea. It was something she could see with her own eyes. The Washington household treated Ona comparatively well. She received good clothes, shoes, stockings, bonnets, and sometimes small amounts of money to attend entertainment in the city. She could walk through Philadelphia wearing fine clothing and carrying coins in her pocket. But she still could not leave the household permanently. George Washington later claimed she had been brought up and treated more like a child than a servant. He intended the statement as proof of kindness. But there was a contradiction hidden inside it. A child grows up. A child eventually chooses where to live. A child can walk away. Ona could not. She could have good clothing, good food, and occasional entertainment, but she could not own the one thing that mattered most, herself. Then there was Pennsylvania law. The Gradual Abolition Act of 1780 placed limits on slavery in the state. The Washington household knew that enslaved people brought into Pennsylvania could eventually become free if they remained there long enough. So a system was created. Enslaved workers were periodically moved back to Virginia before the legal deadline and replaced with others. The clock was reset again and again. Washington even instructed his secretary, Tobias Lear, that the rotations should happen under a pretext that could deceive both the enslaved people and the public. Ona eventually understood what was happening. She was not simply living in Philadelphia. She was being moved across a state line so the law could never reach her. She kept sewing. She kept dressing Martha Washington. She kept her face calm. But somewhere inside, the arithmetic of her life had changed. She now understood that freedom might be possible, and that the people around her were deliberately preventing her from reaching it. Then, in 1796, the future became unbearable. Martha Washington's granddaughter, Eliza Parke Custis, had married and was preparing to establish her own household. She needed a maid. Martha Washington had one to give her. Ona Judge. The decision was not described as punishment. It was a family arrangement, a wedding gift. Ona would be transferred to Eliza Custis and remain enslaved under her control. But Ona understood exactly what that meant. This was not another temporary move. There would be no 6-month clock. No return trip to Philadelphia. No northern city waiting for her. She would become the permanent property of another woman, and potentially of that woman's children after her. Years later, Ona explained that she had 2 reasons for escaping. First, she wanted to be free. Second, she had learned that she was going to become the property of a granddaughter named Custis. Her decision was simple. I was determined never to be her slave. The Washington family was preparing to travel south. Trunks were being packed. The household was busy, and Ona began packing too. She did not announce her plans. She quietly sent her belongings to friends in Philadelphia, piece by piece. By the time she was ready to leave, almost nothing of hers remained inside the presidential residence. Later, she described the moment with astonishing simplicity. While they were packing to go to Virginia, she was packing to go too. I didn't know where. She did not have a perfect plan. She did not know exactly what the future held. She only knew she had to leave. On May 21, 1796, the Washington family sat down to dinner. And while the president, the first lady, and the household were eating, Ona Judge put on her bonnet, stepped outside, and disappeared into Philadelphia. There was no dramatic confrontation, no struggle, no chase through the streets. Just a young woman walking away while the most powerful family in America finished its meal. 2 days later, the advertisement appeared. $10. Her description: a warning that she might try to pass as a free woman or escape by ship. And the claim that she had left without provocation. But the advertisement was right about one thing. Ona was planning to leave by ship. She had secured passage aboard the Nancy, commanded by Captain John Bowles, bound for Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Someone had helped her arrange it. Someone had told her where to go. Someone had made her escape possible. But Ona refused to reveal that person's identity. Decades later, she explained why. She feared the Washingtons would punish him. She carried that secret for nearly half a century. Portsmouth was 300 miles away. It was colder, smaller, and unfamiliar. But for the first time in her life, Ona woke up in the morning knowing that nobody owned her. She found work. She found shelter. She began building a life. She had been born inside the household of the first president of the United States. Now she was simply Ona Judge, a black woman living on her own terms. She believed the distance might protect her. But Portsmouth was not large, and the Washington family's network was larger than she imagined. A young woman named Elizabeth Langdon eventually recognized her. Elizabeth was the daughter of Senator John Langdon and knew the Washington family through their social connections. She recognized Ona from her time around the Washington household. Word traveled south. Soon, George Washington knew where Ona was. Washington did not simply send men to seize her. He went through the government. The Secretary of the Treasury, Oliver Wolcott, became involved. The federal customs collector in Portsmouth, Joseph Whipple, was asked to locate her. Whipple found Ona, but instead of simply forcing her onto a ship, he listened to her. Ona told him the truth. She had not been kidnapped. She had not been seduced. She had left because she wanted freedom. Whipple recorded her words as a thirst for complete freedom. And then Ona offered a compromise. She would return voluntarily if the Washingtons promised that she would eventually be free. She was willing to serve them. She simply refused to spend the rest of her life vulnerable to being given away. If they would not agree, she said she would rather suffer death than return to slavery. George Washington refused. In his response, he repeated the claim that Ona had left without provocation. He rejected her explanation and insisted that she had been enticed away. He refused to promise her freedom. He argued that rewarding her escape would encourage other enslaved servants to do the same. To Washington, her act was disobedience. To Ona, it was freedom. He wanted her back. But there was one thing he feared almost as much as losing her: public outrage. He instructed officials to avoid any action that might cause a mob or riot. In a northern city with strong anti-slavery sentiment, forcibly dragging a young woman onto a ship could create exactly the political crisis he wanted to avoid. So the attempt failed. Ona Judge remained free. In January of 1797, Ona married a free black sailor named John Staines. For a few years, she built something that looked like an ordinary life. There was a husband, a home, and eventually 3 children. But the Washington family had not forgotten her. In 1799, Martha Washington's nephew, Burwell Bassett, came north. He had another mission: bring Ona back, by force if necessary. Bassett found her and asked her to return. She refused. Then he discussed his plans over dinner at the home of Senator John Langdon. Langdon understood what was happening, and that night he sent someone to warn Ona. Her husband was away at sea. Her infant daughter was with her. Ona did not wait. She hired a horse and carriage, took her baby in her arms, and rode through the darkness to the home of Nancy Jack, a free black woman in Greenland, New Hampshire. Bassett came looking for her. She was gone. Once again, Ona had disappeared just before the people searching for her could take her. For months later, on December 14, 1799, George Washington died. Years later, Ona would remember that after his death. They never troubled me anymore. But there was a painful irony. George Washington had never legally owned her. When his will was read, Washington ordered that the enslaved people he personally owned would eventually be freed after Martha Washington's death. More than 100 people were included. Ona's name was not there. Could not be. She belonged to the Custis estate. Washington had never possessed the legal authority to free her. The freedom she had gained had not been granted by him. She had taken it herself. Then Martha Washington died in 1802. The Custis estate was divided. Enslaved people were distributed among Martha's grandchildren. Families were separated. And Ona's younger sister, Delphi, was transferred to Eliza Park Custis Law, the same woman who had once been supposed to receive Ona as a wedding present. The wedding gift had not disappeared. It had simply been reassigned. Ona had escaped to avoid that fate. Her sister received it instead. For Ona, this was the cruelest possibility. She had left Virginia knowing she might never see her mother or sister again. She had chosen freedom anyway. And now the system she had escaped from had reached across the distance and claimed her sister. But there was something Ona did not know. In 1807, Delphi was eventually manumitted. She became free, married a free man named William Costin, and her children lived free. Ona never learned this. She spent decades believing that she had escaped at her sister's expense. Then life took almost everything else from her. Her husband, John Staines, died in 1803. Ona was left raising 3 children. Her daughters eventually died before she did. The law continued to cast a shadow over her family. Because she had been born enslaved, her children remained vulnerable to claims from the Custis heirs. Freedom was not simply something she possessed. It was something she had to keep defending. No one ever came to take them. But that did not mean they were safe. By the 1840s, Ona was more than 70 years old. She lived in a poor, cold house at the Bayside in Greenland, New Hampshire with Nancy Jack, the same woman whose home had sheltered her decades earlier when she fled with her baby. The county listed Ona as a pauper and paid for her care. Think about the irony. She had escaped the household of the first president of the United States. She had resisted the Treasury Department. She had outlasted federal officials. She had escaped a second attempt to capture her. And she had remained free for more than 4 decades. Yet the reward for that freedom was not wealth. It was not comfort. It was a cold room and poverty. But she had something no one could give back to the Washington family. She had control over herself. And somewhere during those decades, Ona accomplished something else. She learned to read. The woman who had spent 12 years surrounded by books and educated people, but had never been taught a single letter, eventually learned to read as an adult. No one recorded exactly who taught her. No one knows when it happened. But she learned. And in the spring of 1845, a minister named Adams visited her. He found an elderly woman who had suffered serious illness and was living in poverty. Yet he noticed something about her that seemed almost symbolic. Despite everything she had endured, she remained remarkably upright and dignified. Another visitor, Benjamin Chase, later recorded more of her story. They asked about her escape. She told them about packing, about the ship, about the person who helped her. She finally revealed Captain Bowles's name only because he had already died and could no longer be punished. They asked about George Washington. She remembered him, and eventually they asked the question that mattered most. Was she sorry? Was freedom worth the suffering? Was it worth losing her husband? Worth burying her children? Worth living in poverty? Worth leaving behind her mother and sister? Worth everything? Ona Judge did not hesitate. She said no. She was not sorry. She was free, and she believed that through her freedom, she had become a child of God. Ona Judge Staines died in 1848 in Greenland, New Hampshire. She was approximately 75 years old. There was no grand monument, no presidential memorial, no statue in her honor, but her story survived because, decades after she escaped, she finally got to tell part of it in her own words. And there is one final tragedy. Ona never knew that her sister Delphi eventually became free. She died believing she had traded her sister's future for her own. She never discovered that both sisters ultimately escaped the fate that had been assigned to them. The daughter who stayed eventually became free. The daughter who ran had already spent her entire life fighting for freedom. So perhaps the real ending is not that Ona Judge defeated George Washington. She did not. She did something quieter. She refused to surrender. George Washington had armies behind him, government officials, money, political influence, the law. Ona Judge had none of those things. She had a needle, a few belongings, some friends, a ship, and the determination to decide what happened to her own life. He spent years trying to bring her back. He failed, and that failure matters. Because for one evening in May of 1796, the first president of the United States sat down to dinner believing the people inside his household would still be there when the meal was over. But one of them had already made her decision. Ona Judge put on her bonnet. She stepped into the Philadelphia night. She did not know exactly where she was going. She only knew where she refused to go. And half a century later, when an old woman living in poverty was asked whether freedom had been worth everything it cost her, she gave an answer that outlived the president who had tried to reclaim her. She was free, and for Ona Judge that was enough.